This video was originally released in April of 2020. If you want to see another short documentary like this one, let us know in the comments below. As dawn creeps over the horizon, a flotilla of landing craft are streaming towards the coast of Normandy. The smell of cordite and diesel hangs like a cloak over the English Channel, irritating the nostrils of the men huddled together in the many small boats, pitching and rolling in the heavy swell. In just a few short hours, they will participate in the largest amphibious invasion in history. For many, this is just another firefight, but for a select few brave souls, it will be the first time they have set foot in Europe since the humiliating evacuation at Dunkirk. Men nervously clutch their weapons in anticipation, and the whole world seems to hold its breath. The Second Battle of France is about to begin. By May of 1944, Allied supremacy in the Mediterranean theater remained frustratingly elusive. Hopes had been high after the successful campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, but were quickly dashed during the invasion of mainland Italy, which had been intended to open an easy route straight to Germany's doorstep. Although initially termed the soft underbelly of Europe by Winston Churchill, progress had come to an abrupt halt at the heavily fortified Gustav Line, and Hitler's veteran troops were showing no signs of retreat or surrender. Frustrated by this lack of progress, Allied planners had finally gotten the green light to open their second front. After years of careful deliberation, the invasion of Normandy, codenamed Overlord, was finally commencing. The Allied units involved in the operation consisted of the American First Army and the British Second Army under the overall command of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Each army was assigned to one or more of the 5 Normandy landing sites, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Sword, and Juno. Over 140,000 men would be involved in the initial attack, which was set to hit all beaches simultaneously in the early hours of June 5th. However, due to poor weather conditions, the invasion was launched on June 6th. The Commonwealth forces landing at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches were tasked with capturing Caen, an important rail and road hub, as well as the nearby Copycat airfield. Further west, the American forces would be faced with a bloody struggle for the possession of beaches Omaha and Utah. Their objective was to isolate the Cotentin Peninsula, which contained the vital port city of Cherbourg. Facing every landing army were the formidable defenses of the Atlantic Wall, which had thus far proved almost immune to Allied air raids, and was manned by roughly 50,000 German soldiers. Although a naval bombardment 2 hours prior to the landings had managed to crack open a few of the German bunkers, a number of heavy guns remained intact and opened fire on the approaching landing craft. The men aboard the landing craft could only grit their teeth as 88mm shells splashed around them. The Allies had equipped a number of tanks with canvas skirts so they could be dropped in shallow waters ahead of the infantry. But the 6-foot waves rendered these modifications almost useless. Their transports ended up having to dash for the shore and dump precious cargo directly onto the sand, with several sunk by enemy fire and underwater obstacles in the process. Despite all these setbacks, British soldiers rushed the entrenched German positions, equipped with nothing but their small arms. Even though MG-42s shredded whole platoons as they disembarked, the Germans were unable to repel the armored vehicles that had started to make it ashore. It was one of these vehicles that finally silenced the deadly 88mm gun that had been firing all morning. Between the 2 British sites was Juno Beach, where the Canadians would have a chance to prove they were more than just America's polite neighbor. Shallow reefs and minefields made landing difficult, and the nearby coastal villages were heavily fortified. However, while sustaining heavy casualties, the brave men of the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division broke through the German defenses and secured Juno by mid-afternoon. Having achieved their initial objective, the 3rd Division linked up with British forces from Gold Beach and pushed inland, further fracturing the disorganized German line. US forces, meanwhile, were not having as much luck. From the very moment their landings began at 6:30, things started to go wrong. The amphibious tanks that were sent along with the first wave of infantry could not handle the heavy seas, and only 2 out of 29 even made it to the beaches. A lack of heavy armament meant the infantry could not easily advance, and many were slaughtered as they attempted to cross the barren stretch of sand between the shore and the enemy bunkers. Omaha Beach was the largest to be stormed on D-Day, and the poor weather conditions meant that men often waded ashore only to find themselves in the completely wrong landing zone. With nowhere to hide, these confused soldiers were forced to form ad hoc units and simply press forwards toward the nearest source of enemy fire, their greater objectives forgotten in the chaos of the moment. Looming over the American landing zones was La Puente du Hoc, a 100-foot or 30-meter tall promontory that housed a network of German bunkers and as many as 6 massive 155mm case-mated guns. While men crawled through the sand below, soldiers of the 2nd and 5th Army Ranger Battalions conducted a valiant assault on the enemy stronghold. The 1st Rangers reached the cliffs at 7:10 a.m. and began to scale them using the remaining ladders and grapnel launchers. Enemy resistance was fierce, but the Rangers persevered, systematically clearing the bunkers until they reached the huge casemates where the 155mm guns were located. Only then did they discover the futility of their operation. Both guns were missing, removed days earlier after they proved to be a magnet for Allied bombing runs. In total, the 225-man assault force left nearly half of their number lying dead or wounded, their heavy casualties as much the fault of Allied intelligence as anything else. At 8:30 a.m., the first German counterattack struck Omaha, now the most heavily contested of the 5 landing zones. Several more would follow throughout the day, with the most successful occurring around 4 p.m., when the 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit in the range of the coastline at the time, rocketed through the vulnerable corridor between Juno and Sword. This was, without any exaggeration, the worst-case scenario. No matter how many troops the Allies had landed, they still lacked the firepower to deal with this new threat. Unfortunately for the Germans, this counterattack would be foiled by various factors, which the Allies had been manipulating in anticipation of D-Day. Before we continue to the action, let's pull back a bit and explore a few of these ruses. In April 1944, Allied planes began an intense bombing campaign against German positions in France. With the Luftwaffe occupied in the east, Allied aircraft outnumbered their Axis counterparts by more than 30-1. Allied aviators successfully damaged coastal artillery emplacements and airfields, as well as rail, bridge, and road networks frequently used by the Wehrmacht. However, the Allied bombing campaign was as much about misdirection as it was about destruction. Operation Fortitude was designed to convince the Germans that the Allies would land in northeastern France. As part of the even larger Operation Bodyguard, Fortitude involved false diplomatic communications, false news stories, and the manipulation of known double agents. The Allies even constructed an entire decoy army near Dover. Known as the 1st United States Army Group, this fictional formation was led by none other than General George, I slapped the PTSD out of my soldiers, Patton. As a result, the Axis wasted valuable time and resources fortifying positions near the Pas-de-Calais, and even as far away as the coast of Norway. Men of the 21st Panzers found themselves standing alone and unsupported as the singular armored division available during D-Day. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had foreseen this possibility and had argued that all 10 panzer divisions in France be stationed as close to the coastline as possible. Ultimately, the divisions were split up all over France. But deception alone wasn't enough for the Allies. Troops needed to be inserted behind enemy lines just prior to the landings in order to further disrupt the German response. The only way to do this was via airdrops. Despite the risk, 1 British and 2 American airborne divisions were scheduled to drop on the morning of the invasion. As they approached their drop zones, the C-47 Dakota transport planes of the American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions found themselves subject to unexpectedly heavy anti-aircraft fire. Thanks to this flak, many paratroopers ended up scattered across Normandy. However, enough men landed in their intended zones to prevent the arrival of German reinforcements. British paratroopers were responsible for capturing 2 heavily defended bridges, which they held against repeated attacks from German tanks and artillery. One location was later renamed Pegasus Bridge after the shoulder emblem of the British paratroopers who captured it and held it during D-Day. Members of the 101st and 82nd Divisions also destroyed or captured several other bridges in the Normandy area, further delaying the German response. As D-Day drew to its bloody close, thousands of Allied soldiers lay dead with precious little to show for their sacrifices. Although they had pushed several miles inland, only Gold and Juno beaches had linked up successfully. The other beaches, especially Omaha, were still very exposed. Optimistic Allied planners had assumed that by now, several towns would be under siege and the Cotentin Peninsula would be on the verge of isolation. The reality was that the Allies had failed to achieve any of these objectives and could not hope to hold the beaches against a determined assault. The counterattack by the 21st Panzer Division had been particularly devastating as it prevented forces from Sword and Juno beaches from linking up, thwarting the Allied thrust towards Caen. But as we mentioned before, several factors foiled this assault, the primary one being Allied air superiority, which annihilated the German armored columns, forcing them back from the beaches. After a week spent scrounging up men and materiel, British forces attempted an armored assault on the small town of Villers-Bocage, but were driven back. To make matters worse, resupply efforts were hampered by storms that prevented the deployment of artificial harbors. 2 weeks later, British reinforcements launched Operation Epsom with the aim of finally capturing Caen, which was now being defended by a full 8 panzer divisions, including 2 battalions of deadly Tiger tanks. Thanks to this massive concentration of German armor, the British were repulsed on June 30th after achieving only modest gains. These repeated failures caused tension at Allied headquarters, especially surrounding Bernard Montgomery, who conceived of Epsom. This wouldn't be his last blunder on the Western Front. At this point, the Germans were also suffering from their own supply shortages. With the war in the East taking priority above all else, many of the 60 or so divisions of Army Group B stationed in northern France were severely understrength and lacked heavy equipment. Any attempts to mass the panzers into a decisive force were foiled by Allied bombardment, and sabotage by the French resistance meant that German communications were unreliable at best. The Americans in particular benefited from this situation and spent the rest of the month besieging the port city of Cherbourg, capturing it on June 29th. Unfortunately, the German garrison had sabotaged the port and filled the harbor with mines, rendering it unusable until late August, meaning that the Allies still didn't have a functioning port to bring in adequate reinforcements and supplies. Over in the east, the Canadians finally captured the Copycat airfield on July 9th. However, the British were unable to capitalize on this success and spent most of July banging their heads against the defenses of Caen to no avail. While progress was slow on the eastern side of Normandy, over in the west, the Americans began to work their way west, taking the Saint-Lô Heights just a day after the Desert Fox's unlucky brush with a fighter plane. Though the combat was brutal, the Americans ultimately prevailed, and their success set the stage for the final breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra. On July 25th, Allied air support began performing danger close missions against fortified German positions outside Cherbourg. Although highly controversial, the results spoke for themselves, and the German left flank swiftly began to withdraw. The ensuing Allied advance was slow due to the American forces having to push through fields sowed with a bountiful crop of German landmines just waiting for the tread of an Allied boot. By this point in the invasion, hedgerow warfare was becoming a fact of life. Normandy was covered by thick, dense hedges that served mostly to divide up sections of farmland. Often over 5 meters or 16 feet tall, they provided excellent cover for German infantry, disrupting lines of fire and turning simple fields into miniature fortresses that had to be cleared out one by one, at great cost to the attackers. But despite the nightmare that was the French countryside, the Americans pushed south and reached Avranches by July 30th. With Allied forces moving into Brittany, the Germans still defending Caen were in danger of encirclement. But before they could retreat, the infamous July Plot occurred. This plot was an attempt by several top-ranking German officers to assassinate Hitler and sue for peace with the Allies. Erwin Rommel had supposedly sympathized with some of the plotters, and his involvement was revealed when it collapsed on July 20th. As a result, he was forced to take his own life. Deeply mistrustful of his remaining generals, Hitler took charge of the situation in Normandy himself and demanded an immediate counterattack. By this time, the American spearhead was being led by the newly arrived Third Army. George Patton, now in charge of real soldiers, captured Brittany in the first week of August. At this time, the Germans were busy putting together a heavy assault force consisting of 2 regular and 2 SS panzer divisions. These were intended to cut a swath through US forces behind the spearhead, splitting up the leading elements and allowing the Third Reich to achieve a good old-fashioned encirclement. Had the Wehrmacht successfully hidden this force, they might have actually pulled it off, but few Axis plans stayed secret in 1944. When the panzers attacked on August 7th, they were met with a devastating ambush by Allied anti-tank units. Seizing the opportunity to meet up with Patton's forces, Montgomery's forces in Normandy began a new offensive to the west of Caen. In just a few short days, the tables had turned, and the forces initially meant to encircle the Allies now found themselves the victim of an identical maneuver. Despite his best efforts to throw the Allies back into the Channel, Hitler slowly began to accept the situation in France and finally approved of a retreat. As the Allied forces converged, it became clear that the only chance for the survival of the 2 German armies in Normandy was an escape through Falaise, held by a single Polish armored division. Outnumbered, the Polish fought valiantly, and although they failed to stop the full German retreat, they successfully contained nearly 50,000 German prisoners and forced the Germans to abandon most of their heavy equipment. This was a decisive moment. There was no longer any question of Allied superiority in northern France. Normandy had fallen, and the road to Paris lay open. But before we discuss Paris, let's not let Operation Overlord completely overshadow another massive battle that was brewing on the Western Front, the invasion of southern France, also known as Operation Dragoon. This had originally been meant to coincide with Overlord, and both were topics of discussion during the Terran Conference of 1943, attended by all 3 Allied leaders, Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. Stalin had been enthusiastic about these plans, while Churchill fervently believed that Allied resources would be put to better use invading the Balkans to link up with Soviet forces and prevent a communist monopoly in Eastern Europe. Ultimately, the discussion was settled when Franklin D. Roosevelt agreed with Stalin that the time had come for a cross-channel operation. Overlord was subsequently greenlit, but Dragoon would be shelved for the time being due to logistical concerns. However, the plan was revisited after storms destroyed the artificial harbor at Omaha Beach, which, combined with the sabotage of Cherbourg, created a massive backlog in Allied shipping. As a result, the capture of such ports as Marseille and Toulon suddenly became the clearest solution to the logistical crisis in the north. Although Churchill remained vehemently opposed to the idea, General Charles de Gaulle threw his support behind it. This operation would require a large-scale amphibious invasion involving over 500,000 men and would later be reinforced by the Free French. By contrast, German forces occupying southern France consisted of just 11 divisions under Army Group G. The 3 beaches chosen for the initial landings were designated Alpha, Delta, and Camel. Before the invasion began, the southern branch of the French resistance began a large-scale campaign of sabotage and guerrilla warfare. Unlike the scattered opposition it had been during the early stages of the occupation, the resistance in 1944 was now operating as a paramilitary force officially recognized as the French Forces of the Interior, or FFI. With the help from Allied commandos, the FFI blew up bridges, cut power lines, jammed communications, and attacked isolated German units. Free French commandos were also tasked with silencing the artillery perched atop the daunting 107-meter or 350-foot high cliffs on the mainland. Known as Operation Romeo, this raid involved 800 men. The attack was a major success, with the commandos killing or capturing about 1,000 enemy soldiers while sustaining only a few dozen casualties themselves. This was all merely a prelude to the landings themselves, which took place on August 15th. German soldiers were jolted from their bunks by the sudden scream of air raid sirens. As they scrambled for their gear, the first bombs began to drop, shaking the ground and shattering their hardened concrete bunkers. There was no escape. Thousands of bombers clogged the skies, their pilots relishing in the near-complete air superiority possessed by the Allies. A full-scale naval bombardment followed, with artillery shells up to 14 inches in diameter raining down on the stunned Germans. Although the barrage eased as the transports neared their landing zones, few defenders were willing to take advantage of the reprieve. Alpha and Delta beaches fell with minimal resistance, but Camel Beach held out stubbornly. It was the most heavily defended beach, and throughout repeated shelling and bombing, one section remained defiant, successfully resisting Allied landings until it could be flanked by troops from other zones. Many hard lessons had been learned after the 10,000 casualties on D-Day, and ultimately, the Allies would pay a toll of only 700 dead or wounded for their passage across the Mediterranean. Despite this initial success, the invasion had only just begun. On the morning after the landings, 4 German battalions staged a two-pronged counterattack. Although there was fierce fighting, the offensive was doomed by low morale, bad communication, and a chronic shortage of heavy equipment. The scattered remnants of the German forces were eventually forced to retreat, leaving the Allies free to pour ashore. German commanders now accepted that their positions were unsalvageable. After consultation with the Führer, a withdrawal order was given for Army Group G, but all defensible locations within French territory were to remain manned and resist as long as possible. This uncharacteristic retreat caught the Allies by surprise. In response, the ad hoc task force Butler was thrown together and doggedly pursued Army Group G hundreds of miles inland. In an ironic twist of fate, Allied armor now sped ahead of the main advance, just as the Panzers had during the invasion of France less than 5 years prior. Back in the north, a similar event was taking place, as German Field Marshal Walter Model orchestrated the withdrawal of Army Group B. Model had already proved himself a skilled defensive strategist on the Eastern Front, and his rearguard actions in France would enable some 240,000 soldiers to escape into Belgium. Thanks to this, most of Army Group G withdrew in good order. Resuming in southern France, the Allies continued to advance and besiege the few fortified pockets of Axis resistance left in the region. On August 18th, they surrounded the headquarters of the German 62nd Corps. After days of constant harassment by the French forces of the interior, the exhausted German soldiers surrendered, but not before a single breakout attempt. Meanwhile, French forces assaulted Marseille and Toulon, held by just 2 German divisions. As the French were besieging the cities in the south, the Allied forces in the north were faced with a dilemma. Paris was just over the horizon, but it was still held by a German garrison. As Allied forces inched their way towards the city, the French people rose up in a large-scale uprising on the 19th. At first, German military governor Dietrich von Choltitz attempted to quell the unrest and keep the city open for resisting German forces. Though he accomplished the former, it was clear that his time was up when the Free French 2nd Armored Division arrived 5 days later. Hitler then ordered Choltitz to raze the city. Instead, he surrendered it to the Allies. Soon after, General Charles de Gaulle led a massive 3-day-long parade throughout the city. The Provisional Government of France was finally back on home soil, and French military affairs would now be run directly from the capital. Within another month, almost all of France would be liberated, with German resistance contained to just a few tiny pockets along the coastline. However, the German Reich was far from capitulation. Field Marshal Model's efforts had paid off, and hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened German troops now patiently awaited the next major advance at the Siegfried Line. This vast defensive work would be the equal of the Atlantic Wall, with some sections resisting the Allies right up to the collapse of the Nazi regime in 1945. In the middle of Hürtgen Forest, a Panzer Grenadier crouches behind cover as a convoy of American tanks rumbles down the nearby road. While he waits, the soldier entertains himself with thoughts of the slaughter a mighty Tiger tank could have unleashed against these vulnerable Shermans. But the P-47s swarming overhead have kept the Tigers at bay. As the enemy convoy reaches the crossroads, he worries that his plan may be foiled. But the armored column chooses the left route, and the ambush begins. As he surveys the carnage, the soldier feels a sharp thrill of exultation. He has just proven that, though wounded and limping, the German wolf still has its teeth. In early September 1944, the Allied advance into Western Europe had reached a critical phase. Although France had been liberated, many obstacles still littered the path to ultimate victory. The logistical issues that had plagued the campaign since D-Day were still frustrating Allied quartermasters, leaving forward divisions dangerously undersupplied and ill-equipped to continue their rapid advance into Nazi-occupied territory. The German army, meanwhile, had been able to retreat swiftly and unbroken, and was now busy fortifying key strategic locations in preparation for its final stand. The main problem faced by the invading force was the lack of intact infrastructure. While tremendously successful at the time, the bombing campaigns over France now manifested themselves in the form of broken railways, burnt-out supply depots, and roads cratered beyond use. Supplies sent via the Mediterranean theater would not be available until the two army groups in France finally converged on the 12th. Forcing logistics officers to improvise with systems like the famous Red Ball Express. This was a truck convoy that, at its peak, utilized nearly 6,000 vehicles, many of which were commandeered from divisions newly arrived in France. But this was merely a stopgap measure, and it was clear that new, shorter supply routes back to Britain had to be opened. In an effort to address this critical issue, the 21st Army Group, consisting mostly of British and Canadian soldiers, was tasked with the liberation of the Netherlands, starting with the enormous port facilities of Antwerp. Built on the banks of the Scheldt estuary, the city was poorly defended and seemed like the next logical target. But when the British rolled in on the 4th of September, they discovered almost the entire German 15th Army digging in on an island located right at the mouth of the river. As it turned out, Adolf Hitler was well aware of Antwerp's strategic value, and had declared it and other port cities Festung, or fortresses, that were to resist until the last man. With the push to open the northern ports stalled by staunch resistance and worsening weather conditions endangering the makeshift harbors still packed to capacity in Normandy, Allied High Command was faced with a serious dilemma. General Eisenhower believed that maintaining momentum across the widest front possible was worth the risk of supply shortages. He reasoned that while his enemies were still able to concentrate forces in key locations, their ability to defend against an assault across the entire front line had been severely compromised due to a lack of manpower. Bernard Montgomery, on the other hand, was convinced that this approach would doom the campaign, and insisted on scraping together what resources they had and making a concentrated thrust towards Berlin itself. After much deliberation, Montgomery finally convinced an extremely reluctant Eisenhower to divert men and resources away from the push on Antwerp and instead launch the infamous Operation Market Garden, which saw over 34,000 airborne troops dropped over the Netherlands.